On the 5th of September, 1942, the SS physician Johann Paul Kremer wrote in his personal diary, "Today I witnessed a Sonderaktion for the first time at 3 in the morning. Compared with this, Dante's Inferno seems like a comedy. Auschwitz cannot be called a concentration camp. It is a Vernichtungslager, a camp of annihilation." That same afternoon, Kremer had lunch in the officers' mess and asked to be served more than half of the chicken. He wrote that down too. Kremer was not a serial killer with a psychiatric history. He was a professor of anatomy at the University of Münster, with peer-reviewed publications on cellular metabolism. He arrived at Auschwitz as a replacement doctor in August 1942, stayed for 4 months, and during that time kept the most detailed diary any perpetrator ever left from inside the camp in real time. 20 entries on selections, on gassings, on the removal of organs from living prisoners, and in every entry, 2 or 3 lines about what he had eaten that evening. That diary became evidence at the Krakow trial of 1947. Kremer was sentenced to death. His sentence was commuted. He was released in 1958, and he died of natural causes in Münster in 1964. What the diary revealed was not only the magnitude of the crime, it was its everyday texture. The way extermination was inserted between breakfast and lunch without producing any visible rupture in the fabric of an educated man's day. That is what makes Auschwitz different from any previous category. Not the scale, although the scale is unheard of. Not the individual cruelty of its executioners, although individual cruelty exists and is documented with names and dates. What distinguishes Auschwitz from all the other places where human beings have killed one another is normalization, the process by which mass murder became administrative routine, working hours, production records, a topic of conversation after a meal. This script goes to the places where that normalization produced its strangest and most extreme effects. The things historians have documented and that almost never make it into documentaries because they are difficult to fit into the usual narratives about the camp. In Block 10 of Auschwitz I, the main camp, the SS gynecologist Karl Klauberg carried out mass sterilization experiments on Jewish women between 1942 and 1944. What is known about Klauberg's experiments is partial, because Klauberg died in 1957 before his second trial could take place, and the detailed records of his procedures were never fully recovered. What is known is this: Klauberg injected a caustic substance, probably formic acid in solution, directly into the women's fallopian tubes without anesthesia. The stated objective to Himmler, in a 1943 letter that survived in the archives, was to develop a sterilization method that could be applied by a single doctor to a number of women without their knowing it was happening during the course of an ordinary gynecological examination. In that letter, Klauberg calculated that with the perfected method, a single doctor with 10 assistants could sterilize several hundred women per day. What the women of Block 10 experienced during the injections was a pain that testimonies describe as impossible to compare with anything they had known before. A burning expansion from inside the abdomen that took hours to subside and left an inflammation for days that made it impossible to walk upright. Some developed peritonitis. Some died from the complications. Those who survived were subjected to control X-rays to verify whether the tubes had been blocked, and the X-ray procedure was carried out with doses massively higher than therapeutic levels because speed mattered more than long-term damage. Several of those women developed ovarian cancer decades after liberation. The X-rays were signed with Klauberg's name. He analyzed them himself. He filed them in folders arranged by case number. When Auschwitz was evacuated in January 1945, Klauberg was transferred with his files to Ravensbrück, where he continued the experiments. He was captured by the Soviet Army, tried in the USSR in 1948, and sentenced to 25 years of forced labor. In 1955, he was released as part of a diplomatic agreement between the USSR and West Germany that included the repatriation of German citizens. Upon returning to Germany, Klauberg gave a press conference in which he described his research at Auschwitz as a scientific achievement. Survivor organizations that heard that press conference filed a formal complaint. The trial was being prepared when Klauberg died of a heart attack in August 1957. Block 10 and Block 11 of Auschwitz I were separated by the execution courtyard, the Black Wall, where the SS executed prisoners condemned by the camp court. Between the blocks and the wall, prisoners in the main camp could hear the shots from their barracks. The windows of the blocks facing the courtyard were permanently blocked so no one could see. But the sound was perfect. 2 shots, sometimes 3. then the sound of the body being dragged away. The pattern of sounds was so recognizable that veteran prisoners could know how many people had been executed in a day without seeing anything. Horst Schumann arrived at Auschwitz in 1941 with prior experience in the T4 euthanasia program, where he had supervised the installation of gas chambers and extermination centers for the mentally ill. At Auschwitz, he developed a program parallel to Klauberg's, but based on radiation. He exposed the reproductive organs of men and women to massive doses of X-rays for periods measured in minutes, with the objective of producing sterilization without surgery. The methodology was simple. The prisoner sat or lay in the position that exposed the genitals to the radiation beam and was kept in that position for as long as Schumann determined. The time varied from one experiment to another. Schumann was looking for the minimum dose that would produce permanent sterilization. What those doses produced in practice, in the days and weeks after exposure, were radiation burns on the skin of the genitals and inside the abdomen, with blisters, tissue necrosis, and in the most extreme cases, perforation of the intestines by the radiation passing through the body. Men who had been exposed were later taken to surgery to have their testicles removed, which Schumann examined to determine the degree of damage. Women were subjected to removal of the ovaries. The operations were carried out by SS medical students in training, under the supervision of camp doctors, with the prisoners barely anesthetized because anesthetic was scarce and the prisoners were not considered patients in any sense that would justify the full use of anesthesia. Schumann escaped Germany after the war. He lived in Sudan, then in Ghana, where he practiced medicine under his real name. He was identified in 1966, extradited to Germany, and released in 1972 while awaiting trial, because a medical expert ruled that his state of health made the proceedings impossible. He died in 1983 without ever being convicted. The system of brothels inside Auschwitz is one of the least known aspects of the camp and one of the most difficult to document. Not because the evidence is scarce, but because the survivors largely chose silence for decades. In March 1942, Himmler ordered the establishment of Sonderbauten, special buildings, in the main concentration camps as an incentive system to increase the productivity of prisoners working in industry. The administrative logic was simple. Prisoners who exceeded production quotas would receive coupons redeemable for access to the facilities. At Auschwitz, the brothel was installed in Block 24 of the main camp. The women assigned to Block 24 came mainly from Ravensbrück. The SS recruited, that was the official term, young women from the women's camp under the promise that they would be released after 6 months of service. Most of those who accepted did so because the alternative was progressive deterioration in the labor commandos and eventual death, and 6 months seemed like a possible horizon. The promise of release was never fulfilled for any of them. Block 24 at Auschwitz operated from 1943 until the evacuation of the camp in January 1945. Male prisoners who entered it, using coupons earned in the labor commandos, were given between 6 and 8 minutes per visit, timed. SS guards supervised access. The women assigned there could receive between 10 and 15 men per workday. The medical records of Block 24, which partially survived, document weekly gynecological examinations and treatments for venereal diseases with sulfonamides. The tone of those records is identical to that of the medical records of any ordinary clinic in the Reich. The women of Block 24 received a food ration somewhat better than that of the ordinary blocks. They had access to soap. They slept in individual beds. Those material conditions were the physical expression of the calculation the SS had made about the functional value of keeping them in a physical state that would allow them to continue being used. They were not concessions. They were equipment maintenance. In 1945, when Auschwitz was being evacuated and the Soviet front was advancing from the east, the SS evaluated what to do with the women of Block 24. Most were sent on the death marches toward the west. Some were executed. None were released in accordance with the 6-month promise. The Krakow Tribunal of 1947 included Block 24 among the charges against the camp officials who appeared before it. The defense argued that the women had participated voluntarily. The court rejected that argument. The commando known among the prisoners of Auschwitz-Birkenau as the Leichenkommando, the Corps Commando, existed in the early years of the camp, before the Sonderkommando was specifically assigned to the gas chambers. It was a group of prisoners whose function was to collect the bodies that appeared each morning in the blocks and courtyards and transport them to the crematorium. In 1941, and 1942, when mortality in the main camp was high but the gas chambers were not yet operating at full capacity. The Leichenkommando collected between 30 and 100 bodies each morning, depending on the time of year. Bodies that died during the night in the barracks remained on the bunks or on the floor until the commando arrived. Prisoners who slept beside the dead learned not to move before the commando came, because moving before the established time could be interpreted as unauthorized movement. The function of the Leichenkommando was also administrative. The bodies collected had to be recorded with their tattoo number before being cremated, so that the camp death register would match the prisoner register. The prisoners of the commando were responsible for that verification. They read the numbers on the forearms of the dead and dictated them to a clerk, who wrote them in the register. The operation was carried out with calculated speed, with the same efficiency as any other administrative process in the camp. The selection process on the Birkenau ramp is the best documented of all the camp's procedures, but there is one aspect of that selection that the usual accounts do not capture precisely: speed. The SS doctors who carried out the selection, Joseph Mengele was the best known, but there were others: Fritz Klein, Heinz Thilo, Johann Kremer. During his period there, took between 2 and 5 seconds to point at each person, right or left, the extended finger in one direction or the other. One person every 2 to 5 seconds, for hours, for as long as it took to process the entire train. In the camp's most active months, in the summer of 1944 with the Hungarian transports, between 10,000 and 12,000 people arrived at Birkenau each day. The selection of a train of 50 wagons with 100 people per wagon, that is, 5,000 people, could take 2 or 3 hours. The doctors who performed it ate beforehand, drank coffee, and took turns resting. The testimonies of SS doctors tried after the war describe selection as physically exhausting work because of the hours spent standing, not for any other reason. Several described having become accustomed to the task within a few weeks. One said that after a while you stopped seeing people and started seeing a stream of objects that had to be classified. Josef Mengele carried out selection with an energy that survivors and witnesses consistently described as excessive for a technical procedure. He moved along the ramp quickly, whistled opportunes, called out for twins in a loud voice, pointed with his finger in a motion that several witnesses described as almost musical in its regularity. The image Mengele projected on the ramp was that of someone who enjoyed what he was doing in a way that his own SS colleagues noticed, and in some cases, privately commented on as unusual, even by the standards of the camp. The twins Mengele selected on the ramp were taken to the experiment barracks, in Block 14, and later in specific barracks in Birkenau. They lived with rations somewhat better than the others, and were not assigned to labor commandos. Mengele visited them regularly, brought them sweets, learned their names, and had them call him uncle. Familiarity was part of the protocol. Children who were not afraid cooperated better during measurement sessions, gave blood samples with less resistance, and endured procedures with less reaction than those who entered terrified. The procedures to which the twins were subjected included drawing blood from the left arm in quantities that caused fainting, injections of unidentified substances into the right arm whose effects were observed and recorded, exhaustive bodily measurements that required the children to remain naked for hours, and in some cases, surgeries. Mengele performed skin grafts between twins to study immune response. He also carried out direct injections into the eyes of brown-eyed children, attempting to change the color of the iris to blue by introducing chemical substances. The children subjected to this procedure developed severe eye infections, and in several cases partially lost their sight. When Mengele considered that he had completed the experimental protocol with a pair of twins, he executed both simultaneously by injecting chloroform directly into the heart, so that autopsies could be performed on both bodies at the same time, and the findings would be comparable. The pathologist who performed those autopsies under Mengele's orders was Dr. Miklos Niesli, a Hungarian Jewish doctor selected on the ramp specifically for his specialty. Niesli wrote his memoirs after the war. He described receiving from Mengele the 2 bodies of a pair of 12-year-old twins on the same afternoon and having to complete the simultaneous autopsy protocols in Mengele's presence, while Mengele took notes with the same concentration he would have shown in any other laboratory session. Auschwitz had an internal economy based on the objects confiscated from the deportees. The camp that prisoners called Canada, because of the association of the name with abundance, was the warehouse complex where the possessions of the deportees were sorted before being sent to the Reich. At the height of the camp's operation, Canada contained piles of clothing, suitcases, jewelry, musical instruments, dental prostheses, wig pieces, tools, books, and money from more than 20 European countries, because the deportees arrived with whatever they could carry. The female prisoners who worked in Canada sorting those objects had access to extra food that people hid among their clothes, to medicines, and to money that could be used to bribe guards or buy food inside the camp's black market. The black market of Auschwitz is another of the camp's lesser-known aspects. It existed from the early years, functioning through the exchange of objects or services among prisoners and, in some cases, between prisoners and SS guards. Prisoners who worked in the kitchens stole food and exchanged it for objects. Those who had access to medicines traded them for favors within the Blockhelteste system. SS guards who agreed to take part in this trade did so in exchange for jewelry or money extracted from the deportees' possessions. The records of the Auschwitz trials document several cases of SS guards internally tried by the SS itself for participation in illicit trade with prisoners. In some cases, they were executed for it. The stolen possessions of the deportees were property of the Reich and could not be diverted by individual officials. Inside the camp, there was also an economy of information. Knowing what transport was arriving tomorrow, which block was going to be selected for the next medical inspection, which guard was on duty, and what his mood was that day. That information had real value and moved through networks prisoners had built over months or years. Those with access to the camp's administrative offices, where documentation was processed, were the most important nodes in those networks. Some used that position to save lives systematically, altering records, changing tattoo numbers in the files, entering false illnesses in medical records that protected a person from being selected. That manipulation of the records was detectable if someone looked for it, and those who did it knew that. They did it anyway. The psychiatrist and survivor Viktor Frankl described in Man's Search for Meaning, published in 1946, a psychological mechanism he observed in Auschwitz and called apathy as a defensive reaction. After the first weeks in the camp, once the initial shock had been processed, prisoners developed a kind of emotional cushioning that made it possible to keep functioning. They stopped reacting to blows with expressions of pain. They stopped reacting to the death of those who slept beside them with expressions of grief. They stopped reacting to humiliations with expressions of shame. It was not insensitivity. It was a saving mechanism. The body and mind allocated the available emotional resources to the functions necessary to survive the next day, and stopped allocating them to functions that did not contribute to that survival. What the SS called the Muselman, and what the prisoners themselves also used as a term among one another, was the final stage of that process, the prisoner who had completely exhausted his reserve of response. A Muselman walked with a specific posture, hunched over, eyes unfocused, movements apparently purposeless. He did not respond to orders quickly enough to avoid blows. He did not respond to blows with any expression that guards could interpret as a sign of normal life. The SS recognized them and selected them during the next review. The prisoners themselves avoided them because their presence made visible what could happen to anyone. Primo Levi described the Muselman in If This Is a Man with a precision that goes beyond clinical description. He wrote that the Muselman was the complete witness, the only one who had seen the Gorgon. That the survivors, those who came out, were by definition those who had not reached that extreme point, and therefore their testimony about the worst of the camp was always incomplete. Those who had reached the bottom could not testify because they had not returned. The starvation experiment Johann Paul Kremer carried out in the autumn of 1942 is not well documented in textbooks on the medical experiments of Auschwitz, which tend to focus on Mengele, Klauberg, and Schumann. Kremer selected prisoners in a state of severe emaciation, in the final stage of deterioration from hunger, and extracted samples of muscle, liver, and pancreas from those bodies while they were still alive. In his diary, he noted the physical condition of the subjects before extraction. He described bodies so thin that the internal organs could be felt through the abdominal wall without applying pressure. He also described the state of consciousness of the subjects during the procedure, which in some cases was partial. The extracted samples were preserved in formalin and sent to his laboratory in Münster for histological study of the effects of starvation on human tissue. Kremer's research was scientifically legitimate in its conceptual design. Studying the effects of prolonged fasting on organs is a field of physiology with real medical applications. What made it a crime without mitigation was the source of the subjects. Men and women who had been reduced to that state of emaciation by the camp system, not by choice, and who were subjected to biopsies without consent while still alive. The knowledge Kremer sought could have been sought in other ways. He chose this one, and he wrote it down in a diary where the next entry was about the veal liver he had eaten in the officer's mess. Kremer's research was scientifically legitimate in its conceptual design. Studying the effects of prolonged fasting on organs is a field of physiology with real medical applications. What made it a crime without mitigation was the source of the subjects, men and women who had been reduced to that state of emaciation by the camp system, not by choice, and who were subjected to biopsies without consent while still alive. The knowledge Kremer sought could have been sought in other ways. He chose this one, and he wrote it down in a diary where the next entry was about the veal liver he had eaten in the officer's mess. The hypothermia experiments carried out at Dachau between 1942 and 1943 by Sigmund Rascher were replicated at Auschwitz under Mengele's supervision. Rascher's original objective was to find the most effective method for reviving Luftwaffe pilots who had fallen into the North Sea. The standard experiment consisted of immersing the subject in icy water until body temperature dropped to 28 or 26 degrees Celsius, the threshold at which the heart enters fibrillation. Then different resuscitation methods were tested: hot water bath, heat from lamps, contact with human bodies at normal temperature. Rascher's records documented cooling time, temperature at the moment of cardiac arrest, and the time and method of recovery when there was one. At Auschwitz, variations of the experiment included exposure to outdoor cold instead of immersion in water. The subjects were forced to remain naked outside during the night in sub-zero temperatures. Survival times depended on the ambient temperature, the subject's previous physical condition, and whether there was wind. The records of those sessions, some of which were recovered after the war, have the same format as a meteorological log: temperature, humidity, wind speed, the subject's body temperature at 15-minute intervals, state of consciousness, moment of arrest. Rascher was executed by the SS itself in 1945, not for the experiments but for falsifying the origin of his adopted children in order to present them as biological, which was a violation of the course code of honor. His hypothermia data, however, were used by the American military in studies on survival at sea in the years after the war. The debate over whether the data should be used, given that they had been obtained through crimes, was never resolved unanimously. Some researchers rejected them on principle. Others used them, arguing that rejecting them would not bring the victims back to life and that ignoring them could cost future lives. The capo system in Auschwitz was the most immediate transmission of power between the SS hierarchy and the prisoner population. Capos were prisoners appointed by the SS to supervise other prisoners in the labor commandos and in the blocks, in exchange for marginally better material conditions. What that functional description does not capture is the violence the system produced, which in many cases was greater than that of the SS guards themselves. The capos who appear most often in the testimonies of Auschwitz survivors are not those who exercised the minimum violence necessary to maintain their position. They are those who exercised it excessively, beyond what the function required. Testimonies describe them beating prisoners with work tools, with their fists, with any object available, in episodes that survivors attribute to a need to radically differentiate themselves from the group to which they belonged in order to ensure that the SS kept them in their position. A capo who beat visibly and consistently was a capo whom the SS perceived as efficient and reliable. A capo who did not beat was a capo whose loyalty to the system was questionable. The result was that some of the most extreme acts of violence documented inside Auschwitz were committed by prisoners against other prisoners. Some capos were convicted by post-war courts alongside SS guards. Others never appeared before any court because they had died in the camp or during the evacuation marches. Others lived in Europe after the war without being identified because the survivors who knew them preferred not to have to testify again. In the autumn of 1944, while the cremation grates burned in the upper sector of Birkenau and the Sonderkommando processed the last major transports, several members of that group did something that required a specific kind of determination. They wrote. In Yiddish, in Polish, on scraps of paper they obtained at the margins of their work. They wrote what they were seeing. They wrote at night, hidden, knowing that if they were found writing they would be executed immediately, and also knowing that they were probably going to be executed anyway when the SS decided to rotate the group. Zalman Gradowski was one of them. He had arrived at Auschwitz in December 1942 from Lithuania, with his wife, his mother, his sisters. All of them died in the gas chambers on the day of arrival. Gradowski was selected for the Sonderkommando of the upper sector. For months he wrote a chronicle of what he had seen, of what he was seeing, of the names of the people whose bodies he processed. He buried the manuscripts in metal containers or bottles in the ground around the crematoria, with notes addressed to whoever found them, asking that they be published. Gradowski died in the Sonderkommando revolt of the 7th of October 1944, in which the prisoners of the upper sector attacked the guards with tools and with explosives they had managed to smuggle in through women workers from the Weichsel Union munitions factory. The revolt was crushed within hours. The 450 members of the Sonderkommando who took part were executed. Those who had not taken part were executed as well. Crematorium 4 was destroyed in the revolt by the explosions. The other 3 crematoria were blown up by the SS weeks later, in November. Gradowski's manuscripts were found after the war in different excavations around the crematoria, some in 1945, others in 1952, others in 1970. The final set of Gradowski's papers was found in 1980. Each discovery added pages to a text that had been written in fragments, in darkness, between one work shift and the next, by a man who knew he was going to die and had decided that leaving that record was more important than anything else he could do with the time he had left. Gradowski's text is not a report, it is literature. It contains sentences that begin with the description of a body he has just pulled from the chamber and end with the name of the city that person came from and with an image of what that city must have been like before the war. Gradowski did not have that information. He imagined it. He wrote the name of the city he had read on someone's suitcase label and built around that name an image of life that the corpse before him could not reveal. It was the only homage he could make. The camp records document a practice that veteran prisoners knew and new prisoners discovered in their first weeks. The SS bet on specific prisoners. The wager most documented in testimonies concerned how long it would take for a prisoner who had been marked as close to becoming a Musulman to die. Guards supervising a block or a commando had visibility over the individual condition of prisoners and could make estimates based on direct observation. The bet had a simple form. One said that prisoner number such and such would not make it past the following week. Another said he would. An amount or an object of exchange was agreed upon, and then they waited. The testimonies mentioning this practice come from more than 20 survivors from different blocks and commandos, suggesting that it was not marginal behavior by individual guards, but something widespread enough to be known by the prisoner population in general. None of the Auschwitz trials included this specific practice among the formal charges. The ashes of bodies cremated at Auschwitz-Birkenau had, within the logic of the camp, a secondary economic value. Ashes mixed with crushed bone were sometimes used as agricultural fertilizer on the experimental farms the SS maintained on the grounds around the camp. Camp records document shipments of that material to agricultural facilities. The farms of Auschwitz grew vegetables and raised livestock. Part of the production was consumed in the kitchen of the camp's SS officers. The system was circular in a way that requires no comment. In the autumn of 1944, when the advance of the Red Army from the east made it clear that Auschwitz would be reached within months, the SS began the operation to destroy evidence known as Action 1005. Crematoria 2 and 3 at Birkenau were blown up with explosives in November 1944. The camp archives were partly burned. Some prisoner commandos were sent to destroy the remaining records. In that process, some prisoners with access to the archives managed to hide documentation inside the camp, or pass it to contacts outside the perimeter, or simply memorize data they would dictate to investigators after liberation. On the 27th of January 1945, when the Soviet troops of the 60th Army entered Auschwitz-Birkenau, they found about 7,000 prisoners alive. They also found, in the Canada warehouses that the SS had not had time to empty completely, more than 7 tons of human hair packed for shipment to Germany. The hair had been cut from women in the gas chambers before their bodies were cremated. Soviet witnesses who opened those warehouses described the smell of the hair after months of storage, a specific smell that several said they could never forget. They also found 850 kilos of eyeglasses, hundreds of thousands of garments, and 44,000 pairs of shoes. Shoes are the object that appears most often in the testimonies of the liberators, possibly because they are the most obviously personal. A pile of shoes is uncountable in the same way a number with 6 zeros is uncountable. But a specific shoe, with the shape of the foot that wore it molded into the leather, with the heel more worn down on one side than the other according to the particular way its owner walked, is singular. The Soviet liberators photographed the piles of shoes. Those photographs are in the archives. The shoes remain in the Auschwitz Museum, in display cases with controlled temperature because the leather deteriorates. They have been there for 80 years. The Women's Orchestra of Auschwitz-Birkenau is known mainly through the testimony of Fania Fenelon, a French violinist who survived the camp and published her memoirs in 1976. What those memoirs document about the function of the orchestra goes beyond what the usual accounts capture. The orchestra played at the camp entrance when the labor commandos left in the morning and returned at night to mark the step and maintain cadence. It also played on Sunday afternoons for the entertainment of the SS. It played on special occasions the SS decided to celebrate. And in some documented periods, it played on the ramp when trains arrived. The director of the Birkenau Orchestra from November 1943 was Alma Rosé, an Austrian violinist, Gustav Mahler's niece, who had arrived at the camp in July 1943. Rosé transformed the orchestra from an amateur group into an ensemble that testimonies, including those of the SS themselves, describe as being of genuine professional quality. She rehearsed with a level of demand that the musicians themselves sometimes described as brutal, but that they also recognized as the condition of their survival. An orchestra that played well had a reason to exist. One that played badly could be dissolved, and its members returned to the general commandos. Rosé died suddenly in April 1944. The symptoms described by the survivors who were at her side are compatible with poisoning, although the camp's official diagnosis was botulism. No later investigation established the cause with certainty. She was 37 years old. After her death, the orchestra continued playing under different direction until the evacuation of the camp. What makes the Birkenau Orchestra one of the most disturbing episodes of Auschwitz is not the music itself. It is the fact that the camp's musicians played Schubert and Brahms while, 100 meters away, at the same time, trains unloaded the people who were going to die that afternoon. Some of those musicians could see the trains from where they played. They played anyway, not because they did not know what was happening, but because playing was what made the difference between remaining alive and not remaining alive. The orchestra at Auschwitz was exactly the same as everything else at Auschwitz. A mechanism of survival inside a system designed to make survival increasingly difficult. And like everything else at Auschwitz, its existence was documented. The camp records include administrative notes on rehearsals, on the approved repertoire, on requests for additional instruments submitted by the orchestra's leadership to the SS administration. The request for a second cello is signed. The signature is Alma Rosé's. It is in the archives. The cello was granted. Rudolf Höss, the first commandant of Auschwitz, wrote his autobiography during his pre-trial detention between October 1946 and the spring of 1947. He was executed in the camp he had commanded on the 16th of April 1947 on a gallows built beside Crematorium I, just meters from the building that had been the camp's first gas chamber and that the SS had converted into an air raid shelter toward the end of the war. He climbed the steps of the gallows without the records of the moment indicating any final statement. The autobiography he left behind is one of the most extraordinary documents produced by the Nazi system, not because of its cruelty but because of its tone. Höss described the functioning of Auschwitz in the same register in which a factory manager might describe the production problems of his plant. He described the insufficiency of the original crematoria as a logistical problem that required engineering solutions. He described the reactions of prisoners during selection with the same distance with which a veterinarian might describe the behavior of animals in the presence of a predator. Nowhere in the autobiography, which runs to more than 200 pages, is there a single sentence indicating that Höss understood he had done anything morally different from administering an industrial facility. That is what Auschwitz produced in its most extreme form. Not monsters in the usual sense of the term, but people who had completely reorganized the categories through which they evaluated their own actions, so that what they did not appear in their own internal account as anything different from any other management job. Kremer writing about veal after biopsies on living prisoners. Höss describing crematorium logistics problems, Mengele whistling opera tunes while pointing with his finger. That is the final document of Auschwitz. Not the figures, not the photographs, not the shoes in the display cases. the perfectly articulated normality with which those who did it described it. Everything in Auschwitz was documented. That is what makes it different from any other place where human beings have killed one another. They left the record, they signed it, they filed it, and then they tried to burn it all before anyone who could read it arrived. They did not entirely succeed,